Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Mrs. Bray Reads a Story. So today we're going to read the last of the stories from the Brambly Hedge trilogy, and this next story is called The High Hills. So this is the one where Wilfred goes on a real adventure. Okay, so once again, like with the other Brambly Hedge books, I'll read the book first, and then I'll hold it up for you guys so you can see the pictures after. Okay. So it was the very end of autumn, and the weather was damp and chilly, and Wilfred was spending the day inside with the weavers. Clickety-clack went the loom, whir, whir went the spinning wheel. Lily and Flax were in a hurry. "We must finish in time," said Flax. "We promised Mr. Apple." "What are you making?" asked Wilfred. "Blankets," replied Lily. "Who are they for?" asked Wilfred. "They're for the voles in the high hills," replied Flax. "They have just discovered that the moths have eaten all of their quilts, and they've no time to make new ones before the cold weather comes. They're too busy gathering stores for winter. We're helping out." "Can I help too?" asked Wilfred. "Not just now," said Lily. "Why don't you find yourself a book while I finish spinning this wool?" Okay, so here we've got a really nice picture of Wilfred. And he is in the wool house, and you can see that they're spinning wool and making blankets while he's looking out the window. Okay, it's a very busy little wool house there. They've got all sorts of good stuff. Okay. Wilfred went over to the bookcase. On the shelf, tucked between volumes and on dye stuffs and weaves, he found a thick book called Daring Explorers of Old Hedge Days. He settled himself down comfortably and began to turn the pages. "Sir Hogweed Horehound," he read, "determined to conquer the highest peak of the high hills, for there, he knew, he would discover gold. Alone he set forth, taking in his trusty pack all he would need to survive the rigorous journey." Wilfred sat entranced. The whir of the spinning wheel became the swish of eagle's wings, the clatter of the loom, the sound of falling rocks. The drops of rain in the window, jewels from the depth of some forgotten cave. Was there really gold in the high hills beyond Brambly Hedge? He wondered. Suddenly a door slammed. It was his mother come to fetch him home for tea. "I hope he hasn't been too much trouble," said Mrs. Toadflax. "He's been so quiet we've almost forgotten he was here," said Lily. "You can send him down again tomorrow if you like." Okay, so there is Wilfred reading away, enjoying his book, and there's a picture of the books he had to choose from. Lily and Flax were already hard at work when Wilfred arrived the next morning. He settled down by the window and again to read about Sir Hogweed Horehound and his intrepid search for gold. The morning flew past, and by the time Mr. Apple arrived to collect Wilfred, Flax and Lily were almost finished the cloth. "I'm sorry we couldn't match the yellow," said Flax. "We've used the last of Grandpa Blackthorn's lichen, and no other dye will do." "Never mind," said Mr. Apple. "It's the blankets they need. We'll take them up the hills tomorrow." "The hills," repeated Wilfred. "Are you really going up the high hills?" "Yes," replied Mr. Apple. "Why?" "Can I come?" Wilfred asked desperately. "Oh, please say I can." "Oh, I don't think so," said Mr. Apple. "It's too far. We'll have to stay overnight." "I'll be very good," urged Wilfred. Mr. Apple relented. "We'll see if your mother agrees. Come on, young mouse, it's time to go home." All right, so here we have Flax and Lily and folding a blanket, and Mr. Apple's arrived. And Wilfred is begging Mr. Apple if he can go up to the high hills. Now, what's important about this picture, so you see the blanket they're folding? It's yellow. And remember how they said they couldn't match the yellow? What that means is they ran out of one type of dye, which is Grandpa's blackthorn lichen. That's what they used to dye it yellow. But they ran out of it, so that means that blanket's two different colors of yellow, and it doesn't look very nice. So Mr. Apple said it's okay because it'll keep the voles warm anyway. Okay. To Wilfred's surprise, his mother did agree. "It will do him good to be in the open air," she said. Wilfred rushed upstairs to pack. He knew just what he would need. Sir Hogweed Horehound had a list of essential gear in his book.
A rope, a whistle, food, fire sticks, cooking pots, a ground sheet and blankets, a spoon, a water bottle, and a first aid kit. And I'd better have a special bag for the gold, said Wilfred to himself as he gathered everything together. He went to bed straight after supper. It was a long way to the high hills, and to get to the vole's hole by dusk, they would have to make a very early start. The next morning, soon after dawn, Flex, Lily, and Mr. Apple called for Wilfred. They were carrying packs on their back full of cloth and blankets, and there was honey and cheese and a pudding for the voles from Mrs. Apple. Wilfred hurried down the stairs. "Whatever have you got there?" asked Flax. "It's my essential gear," explained Wilfred. "You won't need a cooking pot. I've got some sandwiches," said Mr. Apple. "But I must take everything," Wilfred said. His lip began to quiver. "How can I find gold without my equipment?" "You'll have to carry it then," said Mr. Apple. "We can't manage any more."
Okay. So you can see Wilfred's packed a lot of stuff there. He's got all of his gear ready to go, and he's leaving, waving bye to his mum there. And he's got a very full pack.
The first part of the journey was easy. The 4 mice went up the hedge past Crabapple Cottage, the Store Stump, and Old Oak Palace. They rounded the weavers' cottages and arrived at the bank of the stream. Carefully, they picked their way over the stepping stones and clambered up to the Buttercup Meadow. Wilfred strode through the grass, occasionally lifting his paw to gaze at the distant peaks. Beyond the Bluebell Woods, he could see the path beginning to climb. Mr. Apple looked back. "How's my young explorer? Ready for lunch?" "Oh, please," Wilfred said, easing off his pack with relief. The mice ate their picnic and enjoyed the late autumn sunshine, but soon it was time to go on. All through the afternoon they walked. The path became steeper and steeper, and when they looked behind them, they could see the fields and woods and hedges spread out far below.
Okay. Now this is a really nice picture. I quite like this one here. You can see as they're walking past all the brambles, you can see the blackberries there and some of the cranberries and saskatoon berries. And the mice are hiking along and with their big packs full of blankets and cloth and Wilfred's adventuring gear.
By tea time, it was getting dark and cold, and the hills were shrouded in mist. At last, they saw a tiny light shining from a rock beneath an old hawthorn tree. "Here we are," said Mr. Apple. "Knock on the door, Wilfred, will you?" An elderly vole opened it a crack, and when he saw Mr. Apple, she cried, "Pip! Fancy you climbing all this way with your bad leg, too. Come in, do." "We couldn't leave you without blankets, now could we?" said Mr. Apple. The mice crowded into the cottage and were soon sitting around the fire, drinking hot bilberry soup and resting their weary paws. For Wilfred, the conversation came and went in drifts, and soon he was fast asleep. Someone lifted him gently into a little bracken bed in the corner, and the next thing he knew, it was breakfast, and he was smelling the delicious smell of sizzling sausage.
Okay. So there's the vole's cottage, and you can see it's a nice comfy little cottage, and they're all gathered around nice and snug and enjoying the fire. And over here we've got the picture of it getting really dark and then seeing the light around tea time.
Wilfred ate heartily. Oat cakes with rowan berry jelly, and he listened to the voles describing their hard life in the hills. He was disappointed when Mr. Apple announced it was time to leave. "Can't we explore a bit first?" he begged. "Flax and I have to get back to work," said Lily. "But why don't you two follow on later?" "Well," relented Mr. Apple, "there are some fine junipers beyond the crag." "And Mrs. Apple loves junipers," said Wilfred. "Let's go get her some." So the mice said goodbye to the voles, and Mr. Apple and Wilfred set off up the winding path. Wilfred ran on ahead and was soon around the crag. When Mr. Apple caught up with him, Wilfred was halfway up a steep face of rock. "Wilfred!" cried Mr. Apple. "Come down!" "Just a minute!" shouted Wilfred. "I found something!"
Okay. Now, Wilfred here made a bad choice. He didn't listen and he ran ahead. So that's not a good choice. All right, so you guys can see here, Wilfred ran ahead. He climbed up a big, steep rock face. And Mr. Apple's way at the bottom there looking for him. He's trying to find him. Mr. Apple watched as Wilfred pulled himself onto the narrow ledge and started scraping at the rock and stuffing something in his pocket. "Look!" cried Wilfred. "Gold!" "Don't be silly, Wilfred," shouted Mr. Apple. "That's not gold. Come down here at once." Wilfred looked over at the side. His voice faltered. "I can't. I'm scared." Mr. Apple was exasperated. "Wait there," he shouted. Slowly he climbed the steep rocks and carefully placing his paws in the clefts of the stones. The ledge was very narrow. "We'll edge along this way. Perhaps the two paths will meet. We certainly can't go down the way we came up." As they walked cautiously along the ledge, an ominous mist began to rise from the valley. "If only we had some rope," said Mr. Apple. "We ought to rope ourselves together." Wilfred put his paw in his pack and produced the rope. Mr. Apple carefully tied it around Wilfred's middle and then around his own. And it was just as well, for a few minutes later they were engulfed in the thick white fog. "Turn to the rock face, Wilfred, and we'll ease our way along one step at a time." Okay. So here we have Wilfred up at the top, and he's pretty scared. Okay, and then we've got at the bottom Mr. Apple and Wilfred easing along the rock. And over on the other side here, we've got Mr. Apple and Wilfred easing along the edge of the cliff there, and all tied together so that way they know where each other is in the fog. They went on for a long time. Then they took a rest. They sat on the wet rock, and the mist parted for a few seconds, just long enough to show a deep, strange valley below. Mr. Apple was worried. He had no idea where they were. It looked as though they were going to have to spend the night on the mountain. It would be very cold and dark, and all he had in his pocket were 2 sandwiches the bulls had given him for the journey down. His leg was feeling stiff and sore, too. What was to be done? So he explained the situation to Wilfred. "It's all my fault," said Wilfred. "I didn't mean for us to get lost. I just wanted to find gold like Sir Hogweed." "Never mind," said Mr. Apple. "We must look for somewhere to spend the night." A short way along the path, the ledge came a little wider. Under an overhang of a small rock, a small cave ran to the back into the mountainside. "Look," said Wilfred, slinging his pack inside. "Base camp." Mr. Apple sat gingerly on the damp moss at the mouth of the cave. Everything felt damp. His whiskers, his clothes, his handkerchief. "I wish I'd brought my pipe so we could have made a fire." He sighed. "Never mind, we'll huddle close and try to keep warm." But Wilfred was busily searching in his pack again. Out came the fire sticks and the tinderbox. "I'll see if there's some dry wood at the back of the cave," he said enthusiastically. "Wilfred," cried Mr. Apple in admiration, "you're a real explorer." Okay, so there they are, finding their cave. And over here, there they are, sitting in the fog. It's a little bit chilly there. Soon they had a cheerful blaze on the ledge of the outside of the cliff. Wilfred produced 2 blankets, and the mice wrapped themselves up snugly while the clothes dried in front of the fire. The little kettle was filled with water from the bottle, and proudly Wilfred set out a feast of bread and cheese and honey cakes. "You know," said Mr. Apple as he settled back against the rock, "I haven't enjoyed a meal so much for years." To while away the time, Mr. Apple began to tell Wilfred stories about his adventurous youth, and as they talked, the mists gradually cleared and a starry sky spread out above them. All was quiet but for the murmur of the stream, which ran through the valley below like a silver ribbon in the moonlight. Warmed by the fire, they soon became drowsy and fell asleep. And there they are, sitting out by the fire. Okay. The next morning, they were woken by the sun shining into the cave. "It's a beautiful day," called Wilfred, peering over the ledge. "I can see a path down the mountain." Mr. Apple sat up and stretched his leg. It still hurt. "We'll have to go down slowly, I'm afraid," he said.
Is it your leg? Said Wilfred. I can help. He brought out a jar of comfrey ointment from his first aid kit. They all packed up and set off down the path. Mr. Apple did the best he could, but his leg was very painful. He managed to get as far as the stream, but then he stopped and sat on a boulder with a sigh. I can't go any further, he said. What are we going to do? The two mice sat in silence and watched the water swirl past the bank. Don't worry, said Wilfred, trying to be cheerful. I'll think of something. Suddenly he jumped up. I've got it. We'll sail down the stream. He ran over to the bank, and with his ice axe, he hooked out some large sticks that had caught behind a rock in the water. Using his rope to lash them together, he made a raft. Come on, said Wilfred. We'll shoot the rapids. So there's Wilfred putting some ointment on Mr. Apple's leg. And on the other picture is Wilfred building a raft. Are you sure this is a good idea? Said Mr. Apple. Wherever will we end up? Don't worry, said Wilfred. It's all going to be all right. Carefully they climbed onto the raft. Mr. Apple let go of the bank, and they were off. They were swept into the middle of the stream and raced down the mountainside, twisting and turning, sweeping and splashing, and careening over the rocks and cutting through the deep banks. My hat! Shouted Wilfred. I've lost my hat. Never mind that, cried Mr. Apple. Just hold on tight. There's a boulder ahead. Wilfred gripped the sides of the raft, and somehow they managed to keep the raft and themselves afloat. Okay, there they are, riding the stream through the rapids, and there goes Wilfred's hat. Down by the stream, Dusty was ferrying a search party of mice over to the Buttercup Meadows, when suddenly he caught sight of a small red hat floating along in the current. Look there, he shouted. All the mice peered over the boat. That's Wilfred's hat, cried out Mrs. Toadflax. Whatever can have happened to him? Can Wilfred swim? Inquired Mrs. Apple anxiously. Meanwhile, Wilfred and Mr. Apple were beginning to enjoy their trip on the river. The ground had leveled out, and the pace of the stream had become gentler. They looked about them with interest. Wilfred, called Mr. Apple, can you see what I see? I'm sure that's our willow ahead. Wilfred stared at the bank. It is, he yelled, and there's the old oak palace and the hornbeam. This is our stream. As they rounded the bend, they saw Brambly Hedge mice climbing out of Dusty's boat. At the very same moment, Mrs. Apple looked up and said, Look, look, there they are. The mice turned in amazement. The raft was almost abreast of them. Quick, shouted Dusty, catch hold of the rope and I'll haul you to shore, and he tossed it to Wilfred. As the two mice clambered out of the raft and up onto the bank, they all hugged each other. Wilfred, you're safe, cried Mrs. Toadflax. My dear, what has happened to your legs? Said Mrs. Apple. Lord Woodmouse took charge. Come on, everybody, let's get these travelers home and dry, and then we can hear their full story. The mice made their way along. Oops, I forgot to show you guys the pictures. Okay. So there we've got the mice finding the hat in the boat, and Wilfred catching the rope that Dusty's throwing out to him. The mice made their way along the hedgerow to the hornbeam tree. Soon everybody was sitting round the fire, eating cake and drinking acorn coffee. Now, tell us exactly what happened, urged Flax. Well, it was all my fault, explained Wilfred again. I was looking for gold and I got stuck. Mr. Apple had to come rescue me and we got lost. And Mr. Apple's leg hurt so much we had to come back on the raft. Did you find any gold? Interrupted Primrose. No, only this silly old dust, said Wilfred, pulling his bag out of his pocket. Flax and Lily gasped. Wilfred, that's not dust. That's Grandpa Blackthorn's lichen. It's very rare. You are clever. Wherever did you find it? Primrose ran to fetch some paper, and Wilfred proudly drew a map so they could find the place again. And when we go, you shall come with us, Wilfred, promised Lily. Okay, so there they all are, and there's Wilfred showing them the Grandpa Blackthorn's lichen he found. Remember, that was the dye that they couldn't find earlier. They ran out of yellow dye. They're all sitting around listening to the stories of their adventures. Mr. Apple was tired, and soon he and Mrs. Apple went home to Crabapple Cottage. One by one, the visitors drifted away. It was time for the explorer to go to bed.
Wilfred followed his mother up the stairs. "What adventures," she said, washing his face and paws and helping him take off his muddy dungarees. Wilfred climbed into bed. As his mother tucked him in, he thought of the night beneath the stars. Snuggling down under the warm blankets, he was soon fast asleep. Okay, and there's Wilfred and his mother helping him get ready for bed. The end. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the Brambly Hedge trilogy. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and stay tuned for our next video of Mrs. Bray Reads a Story. Have a good evening.